A lonely, strong mountain man sheltered two lost settler girls. The next day, their mother whispered, "Will you marry me? You belong to us." The wind came first, needling through the canyon like 1,000 tiny blades, carrying with it the sharp scent of pine and the taste of early snow. October had slipped into winter's grasp sooner than expected, and the mountains held no mercy for the unprepared. Two small figures trudged along a narrow path that twisted between firs and granite. Their breaths came in shallow, ragged bursts. One child was no more than 6, cheeks raw from cold, her little boots too thin for the frozen ground. The other, perhaps 9, held her sister's hand fiercely, jaw set in a way that did not belong on so young a face. Their dresses were torn, hems caked with mud that had frozen into brittle sheets. A ribbon, once blue, hung limp from the older girl's braid. The younger stumbled often, eyes glassy, whispering words too soft to hear. Coyotes cried from somewhere beyond the trees, and the sound made both girls flinch as if struck. Up on the ridge, Paul Barnes paused. He had been checking his traps, rifle slung across his broad back, a length of rawhide rope at his belt. He was a man built by wilderness. Tall, shoulders thick with labor, beard salted with early gray though he was but 36. His coat was patched at the elbows, his gloves stiff from years of wood smoke and bloodied hides. Paul had long ago grown accustomed to silence, to the rhythms of wind and fire and the occasional crack of a rifle echoing off stone. Solitude had shaped him, but it had not hollowed him out. Something deep within, something older than grief, still stirred when he heard suffering. The sight of the girls moving like shadows in the snow struck that hidden place. He stood still, breath clouding, watching them falter. He could have told himself it wasn't his concern. Folks lost on the mountain rarely survived the night. Yet his boots moved before his thoughts could catch up. He descended the ridge, snow crunching underfoot, and the older girl saw him first. Her eyes widened, wild, frightened, but she didn't run. She simply pulled her sister closer, bracing herself like a cornered fawn. Paul raised a gloved hand, palm outward, no words. He knew how his figure must look, a stranger looming out of snow with a rifle. The younger one whimpered, lips trembling, "Mister." Her voice was faint as frost. That single word seemed to hang between them, heavier than gunfire. Paul crouched low, resting his weight on his haunches so his eyes met theirs. His voice, when he spoke, carried the slow drawl of someone who had learned long ago not to waste breath. "You'll freeze out here." The older girl shook her head stubbornly, though her body swayed. "Mama's coming back. We have to wait." Paul studied her, noting the cracked skin on her hands, the trembling legs, the desperation clinging to her like smoke. He glanced to the trees, then to the darkening sky. The storm was moving fast, curling gray against the peaks. He did not press her with questions. Instead, he removed his coat and wrapped it around both girls, scooping them up as if they weighed nothing. The smaller one buried her face against his chest, sighing in a way that made his heart tighten. The cabin was a mile off, and the path narrowed to little more than deer tracks. Paul carried them without strain, his breath steady despite the climb. Every so often he murmured a reassurance, not to comfort them but because the human voice itself was aflame against the cold. By the time he pushed the cabin door open with his boot, snowflakes clung to his beard, and both girls were near unconscious. The warmth hit them like a blow, the crackle of fire on the hearth, the smell of venison stew still simmering in an iron pot. He lowered them onto a cot near the wall, their small bodies shivering beneath his heavy coat. The younger girl's lips moved. "Mama, she'll come." Paul knelt, tucking a blanket around them, his calloused hands surprisingly gentle. He did not ask again where their mother was. Some answers could wait until warmth returned to their blood. He spooned broth into a tin cup, coaxing them to sip. The eldest resisted at first, pride stiffening her chin, but when her sister swallowed greedily, she followed. Silence stretched, broken only by the hiss of fire and the rattle of wind against the shutters. Paul sat back on a stool, elbows resting on his knees, watching them. The girls did not speak much, exhaustion dragging at their eyelids. Yet even in that drowsy haze, the elder's eyes flicked to him with a wary kind of gratitude. He wondered who they belonged to, what story had carried them into the teeth of a mountain storm. But Paul had lived long enough to know that survival came before answers. He rose, moving with a quiet precision, adding logs to the fire, pulling a kettle to warm water, setting bread near the coals. His every action said what his lips did not: they were safe for now. Outside, the storm thickened. Snow fell harder, muting the world in white. Inside, the glow of the fire painted the cabin walls amber, flickering across the rifles mounted above the door, the shelves lined with jars of dried beans and herbs. The girls huddled close, their breathing slowly deepening. Paul remained by the fire, listening, his hand absently brushing the scar along his jaw. He had not planned for company. He had not wanted it. Yet as the storm howled beyond the walls, the sound of their breathing filled the cabin like a hymn. The night deepened. At one point the younger stirred, whispering something about coyotes. Paul went to the shutter, opened it a crack, and scanned the snow-blanketed dark. Yellow eyes flickered beyond the tree lean, cautious, hungry. He closed the shutter firmly, returning to the cot. "They won't touch you," he said simply. The girl gave a faint nod and drifted back into sleep. Hours passed, the storm refusing to ease. Paul sat in his chair, boots crossed at the ankle, rifle leaning nearby. He did not sleep. His eyes lingered on the children, the way their small hands clutched at the blanket, the way innocence looked when tested by wilderness. He felt something stir within him, an echo of a life he had buried long ago. Just before dawn, the wind slowed. The storm's fury dulled to a steady hush. Paul rose, stepping outside briefly to breathe the frozen air. Snow lay thick across the ground, burying the path. He looked toward the ridge where he'd first seen them. Tracks were already swallowed. The wilderness gave nothing back once it had claimed it. When he re-entered, the eldest girl was awake, eyes sharp in the half-light. She sat upright, her sister still curled beside her. She studied him with a mixture of fear and trust that only a child could hold both at once. Then, after a long silence, she whispered, "You won't let them take us, will you?" The words caught Paul off guard. Not the desperation. He had expected that, but the certainty beneath it, as if she already knew enemies walked these woods. He opened his mouth to answer, but the words did not come easily. Instead, he simply reached down, pulling the blanket higher around her shoulders, his gaze steady on hers. The girl's eyes searched his face, seeking something she needed more than fire or bread. His silence became its own kind of vow. And then, from beyond the cabin walls, faint but undeniable, came the crack of a rifle shot. It echoed across the frozen valley, shattering the fragile dawn. The girl's eyes widened. Paul turned toward the sound, jaw tightening, and reached for his rifle. The storm had passed, but the danger had only just begun. The dawn light sifted pale and cold through the cabin shutters, drawing thin lines across the floorboards. Paul Barnes stood by the hearth, turning venison strips over a pan, the meat sizzling in lard. The scent filled the small room, rich and grounding, a sharp contrast to the brittle air outside. Behind him, the two girls stirred under blankets, shifting restlessly as if their dreams were tangled with the storm still muttering against the roof. He watched them from the corner of his eye. The younger, hair in a tangled halo, blinked herself awake, lips parted in confusion before recognition softened her face. She clutched at the wool blanket as though it might disappear if she loosened her grip. The older girl rose more cautiously, eyes flicking to the door, then to Paul, as though she expected the world to demand something of her the moment she stood. Without speaking, Paul set 2 tin plates on the table. The scrape of metal on wood echoed in the quiet. He gestured toward the food, his movements unhurried. The younger climbed down first, bare feet pattering on the plank floor, drawn by hunger stronger than fear. The older followed, guiding her sister with a protective hand. They ate quickly, eyes downcast, though the younger sneaked glances at him between mouthfuls. Paul sat across the table, chewing methodically, gaze steady on his plate. Words were unnecessary. The sound of their forks tapping against tin was conversation enough. Yet beneath the silence lay an unspoken current, trust beginning to grow roots in the warmth of shared bread. After the meal, Paul stoked the fire and set a kettle of water to boil. The cabin, though small, held a rough sense of order. A shelf lined with jars of dried beans, bundles of herbs hanging from rafters, Tools leaned neatly near the door. Life had been pared down to what survived the mountains. The girls explored cautiously, their small fingers brushing the grain of a carved wooden stool, tracing the handle of a hunting knife set out of reach. The younger found a wooden horse, worn smooth from years of handling. She lifted it, delight flashing across her face before she caught her sister's wary look and clutched it tight against her chest. Paul watched, saying nothing. That toy had once belonged to his brother, long gone, but he let it rest in the child's hands. Something about the sight pressed on him, a reminder of what time had taken, yet also of what remained possible. By midday the storm had quieted to a steady fall of flakes, dusting the world in white silence. Paul moved outside to split wood, the rhythmic thud of his axe punctuating the hush. From the window, the girls watched him, their faces pressed to the glass, eyes wide at the sight of a man hewing through timber as if the act itself could keep the wilderness at bay. When he carried the logs inside, shoulders wet with melting snow, they scurried back to the hearth, pretending they hadn't been watching. The hours stretched in quiet patterns. Paul mended a boot by the fire. The older girl brushed her sister's hair with patient strokes, untangling knots. At times the younger whispered questions. Would Mama find them? Would the snow stop? Paul heard but didn't intrude. He understood the sacredness of words passed between siblings, how fragile they were when overheard. It wasn't until evening that the eldest finally spoke directly to him. She was standing near the window, watching snow gather on the sill. Her voice was steady, though her small hands twisted the ribbon at her wrist. Mama told us if we got lost, we should find a man with a kind face. She glanced at him, almost daring him to prove otherwise. Paul met her gaze. The firelight caught in her eyes, revealing both fear and defiance. And you think I've got one? His voice was quiet, almost rough from disuse. She shrugged, though her mouth curved toward something like a smile. You didn't leave us. That simple truth settled between them. Paul returned to his work, but the words stayed in his chest, warmer than the fire. As night came, the cabin's small world grew softer. The girls curled near the hearth, whispering stories of their mother, how she sang while hanging laundry, how she braided ribbons into their hair, how she promised them a home safe from men with cruel hands. Paul listened without letting on, their voices painting a portrait of a woman who existed like a lantern in their memory, still burning somewhere in the storm. Sleep came to them sooner that night. The younger, toy horse clutched in her arms, sighed into dreams. The elder, though, stayed awake longer, watching Paul as he sat sharpening his knife by firelight. She studied him not with fear now, but with the caution of someone learning whether a man could be trusted. Finally her eyes closed, lashes dark against her cheeks, her breath evening out. Paul set the knife aside. He leaned back in his chair, gaze lingering on the two small forms wrapped in blankets. Something within him shifted, an ache he hadn't felt in years pressing against his ribs. Loneliness had long been a familiar companion, one he had accepted as permanent as the mountain itself. Yet in the space of a single day, the sound of children's breathing had altered the silence he'd once clung to. Before dawn he woke to a sound, the snap of a branch outside. His hand went instantly to the rifle propped against the wall. He moved to the window, careful not to wake them, and peered into the pale blue dark. Snow lay heavy on the trees, but no figure stirred among them. Only the wind moved, rattling bare branches like bones. Still, the unease stayed with him. When daylight came, the girls rose stiff and quiet, their small bodies weary from travel and cold. Paul gave them warm water to wash their faces, set bread and honey on the table. The elder ate slowly, eyes scanning the window as if expecting someone to appear. The younger, less guarded, hummed softly while nibbling, her voice carrying a melody that echoed faintly of lullabies. After the meal, Paul prepared to head into the woods to check his traps. He paused at the door, hand on the latch, and looked back. The girls were watching him, the same question mirrored in both their faces. Would he return? He gave a short nod, then stepped out, the snow crunching beneath his boots. Hours later he came back with a brace of rabbits slung over his shoulder. He found them where he had left them, though the older had drawn her sister close on the cot, as if bracing against abandonment. Relief flashed across her face when the door creaked open. She masked it quickly, but Paul saw. That evening, while skinning the rabbits, Paul finally asked, "Your mother? You said she'd find you." The elder nodded. "She's looking. She always finds us." Her voice carried certainty, but her eyes betrayed doubt. Paul chose not to press. Instead, he slid the cleaned meat into the pot and said, "Then we'll keep watch till she does." It was a vow spoken simply, yet it carried the weight of mountains. The girl blinked, then gave the smallest of nods, her shoulders easing as if she had been carrying more than her years allowed. Night descended with a brittle cold, stars burning sharp above the ridge. Inside, the cabin held a fragile peace. Paul sat near the fire, carving a new figure from a block of cedar, clumsy, rough-hewn, but shaped like a horse. The younger, awake just enough to notice, smiled through drooping eyes. The elder, already drifting, whispered words so faint he almost missed them. "You won't let them take us." Paul's hand stilled on the knife. He looked at her, her face half lit by firelight, innocence and burden tangled together. He opened his mouth, but again silence became his promise. And then, just as the last log settled into embers, a sound cut through the night. Faint at first, then sharper, the unmistakable echo of hooves striking frozen ground, carrying from the valley below. Paul rose slowly, setting the carving aside, his rifle already in hand. The girls slept on, unaware. But Paul knew the mountains carried no visitors without reason. Whoever rode in the dark would not come seeking peace. The fragile sanctuary had already begun to crack. The morning after the hoofbeats, the mountain air carried a tension sharper than frost. Paul Barnes moved through the cabin with a quiet precision, every gesture edged with wariness. The girls still slept on the cot, the younger curled into her sister's side, clutching the wooden horse as if it were armor. Outside, the snow had hardened overnight, crusting the ground into a brittle shell that cracked beneath his boots. He circled the clearing, scanning for prints. There were none near the cabin, only the faint trail of riders passing through the valley, their path bending north. Yet he knew such men did not ride mountains for leisure. When he returned inside, he found the eldest girl awake, sitting upright, eyes on the door as if she had expected him not to come back. Relief flickered across her face before she masked it with the stubborn set of her mouth. She asked nothing about what he had seen. Instead, she said, "Mama will come today. I know it." Her voice trembled, betraying both hope and fear. Paul studied her in silence, then ladled porridge into tin bowls. The smell of oats thickened the air, comforting in its plainness. He set the bowls down without comment. Words were a scarce currency with him, but the act of feeding was its own language, and the girl seemed to understand. It was near midday when the knock came. A single rap, brittle as a branch snapping under snow. Paul's hand went immediately to the rifle. He opened the door with caution, and there she stood, barely upright, cheeks hollowed from hunger, hair tangled with ice, her shawl torn. The girls gasped in unison, rushing forward. "Mama!" The woman, Ruth, sank to her knees as her daughters clung to her. Tears froze against her lashes, her hands trembling as she stroked their hair. Relief and exhaustion warred on her face. Paul stepped aside, letting the reunion fill the cabin with warmth that no fire could match. He shut the door against the cold, his presence a shadow behind them, unwilling to intrude on something sacred. It took time before Ruth could even meet his gaze. When she did, her eyes held both gratitude and suspicion, as if she didn't know whether to thank or fear him. Her voice was hoarse, scraped raw by nights of calling into empty woods. "You sheltered them." Paul inclined his head. He offered water, which she drank in small, painful gulps. The girls never left her side, their hands still tangled in her skirts as though they feared she might vanish again. As the hours stretched, Ruth began to speak in fragments, each word pulled like a thorn from flesh. She told of the wagon they'd traveled with, a small group of settlers bound for safer valleys. Of her husband, Thomas, gunned down in a raid when outlaws struck the camp. Of flames licking canvas and screaming horses scattering into the dark. She had fled with her daughters into the timber, chased by men who wanted more than supplies. For days she had hidden, guiding the girls through gulches and streams, until hunger and cold forced her to leave them briefly while she searched for food. When the storm came, she lost her way. Her voice faltered when she spoke of the raiders. "They're not finished. They hunt like wolves. They'll come for what they think they're owed." She pressed her daughters closer, eyes flaring with a mixture of rage and fear. "They'll never stop until we're ash in the snow." Paul listened, his face unreadable. He asked no questions, offered no consolations. Yet something in his stillness steadied her, as if his silence itself promised he had heard everything that mattered. That night, after the girls fell into exhausted sleep, Ruth sat by the fire, shawl wrapped tight, watching Paul skin a rabbit. The flames carved his features in gold and shadow, highlighting the scars that spoke of years hard-lived. At last she broke the quiet. "Why did you take them in?" He didn't look up. "Because they were cold." Her mouth tightened, not at the answer but at the simplicity of it. She nodded slowly, as though the truth of such plainness was more comfort than any oath. For the first time, her shoulders eased. Days passed. Snow fell heavier, muting the world. Inside the cabin, small rhythms bloomed. The girls laughed more, their hunger eased by hot meals. Ruth helped mend Paul's worn shirts, her stitches neat despite hands cracked from cold. Paul, in turn, set traps closer to the cabin, ensuring food came steady. They moved around each other like stones in a river, slow to shift, but forming a current of shared survival. Yet beneath the quiet, unease grew. Once, while fetching water from the creek, Paul found boot prints, fresh, pressed deep into the snow, not his own. He studied them, then brushed snow over them to hide the trail. When he returned, he said nothing, but that night he cleaned his rifle with deliberate care. Ruth watched him, her face paling, though she didn't ask. She already knew. The girls sensed it too. Their play grew quieter, laughter thinning when the wind carried strange echoes through the valley. Once, the younger startled awake, crying that she had heard men's voices outside. Paul went to the door, stepping into the snow with rifle raised, but the night was empty save for the groan of pines under ice. Still, he stayed outside until dawn, boots planted firm, watching the ridge. It was on the fourth day that a trapper came. A lean man, beard rimed with frost, carrying pelts over one shoulder. He hailed the cabin with caution, greeting Paul as an old acquaintance from the lower valley. Over stew, he spoke of trouble brewing, outlaws prowling the region, led by a man named Coulter. Coulter's gang had struck camps and ranches alike, leaving few alive to tell it. "They're close," the trapper warned, voice low. "Heard they were combing these mountains, hunting a woman and 2 children. Say she ran from 'em after they burned her camp." The words fell heavy in the cabin. Ruth's face went white, her hands trembling as she pulled her daughters close. Paul's jaw tightened. He said nothing, but the silence was its own vow. After the trapper left, Ruth stood by the window, staring at the falling snow. "They won't stop," she whispered. "Coulter, he doesn't just take. He marks what he wants. And he always comes back for it." Her voice broke, and for the first time, Paul saw the weight she carried not as fear, but as fury, a mother's rage sharpened by loss. He moved to her side, not touching, but standing close enough that she felt the steadiness of his presence. His words were few, but they carried iron. "They won't have you." She turned to him, eyes brimming, as if trying to measure whether he believed what he said. Then she nodded, clinging to the only certainty left in a world that had taken too much. That evening, Paul set about preparing. He reinforced the shutters with extra planks, stacked firewood higher, sharpened blades until they gleamed. Ruth helped without being asked, braiding rope, grinding corn into meal, her movements quick, determined. The girls watched silently, sensing the shift, their innocence edged by the knowledge that danger waited beyond the trees. When the chores were done, Ruth sat with her daughters by the fire. She told them stories of their father, his laugh, his way of lifting them onto his shoulders, the songs he hummed when the day's work was done. The girls listened with wide eyes, clinging to the memory of a man they would never see again. Paul sat apart, listening in silence, his face unreadable, though inside him something stirred. He had long buried his own memories of family, yet hearing hers, he felt the ache of what it meant to be needed. The night deepened, snow falling in thick silence. The girls slept, but Ruth remained awake, staring into the fire. She spoke softly, almost to herself. I should have died with him. Would have been easier than running. Paul turned his head, meeting her gaze. His voice was low, steady. Easier, maybe. But not better. Not for them. He nodded toward the sleeping girls. Her lips parted, a sob caught in her throat, but she swallowed it. For the first time, gratitude softened the sharpness in her eyes. The next morning, while the sky was still pale, Paul spotted movement on the ridge. Figures, distant, dark against the snow. Too many to be hunters. Too careful to be travelers. They lingered just long enough for him to know they had seen the smoke from his chimney. Then they vanished into the trees. He returned to the cabin, face grim. Ruth looked up at him, reading the truth before he spoke. Her hand tightened around the younger girl's shoulder, her knuckles white. They've found us, Paul said. The words settled like stones in the room, final and heavy. Ruth drew her daughters closer, her voice breaking into a whisper. Then it begins. And outside, in the frozen silence of the valley, the first raven cried, a dark echo rolling through the snowbound trees, as if carrying Coulter's promise with it. The ridge lay quiet at first light, the snow brittle and blue in the cold. Paul Barnes crouched at the window, his rifle braced across the sill, eyes fixed on the timberline where shadows pooled. The girls still slept, their breath steady, though Ruth was awake, shawl tight around her shoulders, her eyes following him with an unspoken question. He didn't answer it. The truth was already on the air. He could smell smoke faintly, the acrid kind that clung to men who lived by fire and plunder. By mid-morning, the silence broke. A horse's whinny echoed down the slope, then the creak of saddles, the rough laughter of men. Paul tensed, every line of his body ready. He gestured for Ruth to move the girls to the back corner, behind the cot. She obeyed, her movements swift but steady, pulling them close, whispering calm even as her own fear glinted like glass in her eyes. The first figure appeared at the edge of the clearing, tall, broad, draped in a wolfskin cloak. Coulter. His reputation had preceded him, a man who took joy in burning what others built. His face was scarred across one cheek, beard thick and black, eyes pale and cold as river ice. He sat astride a bay horse, flanked by half a dozen men, each armed and hungry-looking. Barnes. Coulter's voice cracked across the snow. You've got what's mine. Step out now, and I'll let you keep your skin. Paul rose from the window and pushed open the cabin door, stepping into the clearing. The cold bit into his lungs, the sky a flat gray above. Rifle steady in his hands, he said nothing. His silence a defiance sharper than words. Coulter grinned, showing broken teeth. You've gone soft, mountain man. Hiding women and brats? That ain't your kind of company. Hand them over. Last chance. Paul's answer was the click of his rifle's hammer drawn back. The sound cut through the clearing, simple and final. The outlaws shifted, uneasy, but Coulter laughed, the sound low and mean. He swung down from his horse, boots crunching in snow, and began to advance. His men followed, spreading out, rifles half-raised. Paul fired first. The crack shattered the air, sending one outlaw sprawling into the snow, blood blooming bright against the white. The clearing erupted, gunfire flashing, smoke curling, shouts splitting the silence. Paul moved with precision, each shot deliberate, the rhythm of survival burned into him. 2 more men dropped before they could close the distance. But Coulter's gang was larger than the clearing could hold. They pressed forward, bullets striking the cabin walls, splinters flying. Inside, Ruth pulled the girls to the floor, covering their ears as glass shattered. Fear clawed her chest, but rage steadied her hands. When Paul ducked back through the doorway to reload, she snatched another rifle from the wall and thrust it toward him. "Take it," she said, her voice breaking but fierce. Their eyes met, hers blazing with defiance, his with something softer, a recognition. He took the weapon, nodding once before stepping back into the storm. The fight grew savage. Smoke thickened the air, mingling with snowflakes. Paul used the trees, ducking between trunks, firing from cover. He moved like he knew every rock and hollow, drawing the men deeper into his ground. 2 fell to his bullets, another to the axe he carried on his belt, swung in a blur that left red on the snow. But Coulter pressed on, relentless, his rifle barking flame. A bullet grazed Paul's shoulder, burning hot, but he kept moving, teeth clenched against pain. He circled back toward the cabin, where Ruth had taken position at the window, steadying a pistol with shaking hands. An outlaw lunged too close, and her shot rang out, dropping him inches from the door. Her daughters clutched her skirts, eyes wide, but Ruth did not falter. In that moment, Paul saw in her not fear but the steel of someone who had lost too much to bow now. The clearing thinned with bodies, only Coulter and two men still standing. The outlaws cursed, their bravado leaking away with each breath of gun smoke. Paul crouched behind a stump, breath ragged, rifle empty. Snow stung his eyes, blood warming his sleeve where it soaked through his coat. Coulter stepped forward, eyes narrowed, his voice rising above the quiet. "Barnes, you can't win. You'll die here, same as your kin before you. Give me the woman, and maybe I'll let you rot in peace." Paul rose, axe in one hand, the empty rifle in the other. His voice carried low, rough, but clear. "You'll touch none of them." The final standoff came swift. One outlaw raised his rifle, but Ruth fired first, the pistol cracking from the window, dropping him mid-step. Paul charged the other, swinging the axe with a brutal arc that split through coat and bone, sending him crashing into the snow. That left only Coulter. For a heartbeat, the clearing stilled, the snow falling soft between them. Coulter sneered, pulling a knife from his belt, the blade long and curved. He lunged. Paul met him head-on. The clash was savage, close, steel against steel, fists slamming, boots grinding into snow. Coulter's knife sliced across Paul's coat, tearing flesh beneath. Paul roared, driving his shoulder forward, slamming the outlaw back. They grappled, breath steaming, the knife flashing inches from Paul's throat. From the cabin door, Ruth's voice rang out. Not a scream, but a cry of rage, of warning, of everything she had carried since the night her life burned. Paul heard it, and with a surge, he twisted Coulter's wrist, wrenching the knife free. The blade clattered into the snow. Paul drove the axe's haft hard into Coulter's chest, knocking him sprawling. Coulter gasped, coughing blood, his pale eyes still burning with defiance. "You think you've saved them? You can't hold back the world. It'll take 'em anyway." Paul stood over him, chest heaving, the axe poised. For a long moment, the mountain held its breath. Then, with one final swing, Paul brought the blade down, ending it. The sound of it echoed through the valley, final and unyielding. Silence returned, broken only by the crackle of fire from the hearth inside and the slow settling of snow over the dead. Paul stood, shoulders sagging, breath raw in his throat. Blood streaked his coat, his hands trembling not from fear but from the sheer weight of what had been demanded of him. He turned toward the cabin. Ruth stood framed in the doorway, her daughters clutching her skirts, their faces pale but alive. Her eyes met his, wide with relief and something deeper, a recognition that in this man's defiance they had been delivered from ruin. Paul staggered closer, lowering the axe, the fight's fury draining from him. Ruth stepped forward, her hand trembling as she reached to steady him. For the first time, he let her. Their eyes held, words unnecessary, the truth of what had passed already carved into both their souls. Snow fell gentler now, the storm easing, as if the mountain itself had yielded. The bodies lay still, the valley reclaimed by silence. Inside, the girls huddled near the fire, waiting. Ruth turned to them, then back to Paul. Her voice was low, breaking with tears she could no longer hold. "You saved us," she whispered. Then, stronger, steadier, though her voice trembled with the weight of it, she said, "Will you marry me? You belong to us." The words struck Paul like no bullet ever had. 4 years he had lived alone, shaping his life into silence and stone. Yet here, in the wreckage of violence, a woman and her children claimed him not as protector alone, but as kin. He did not answer at once. His throat tightened, his chest ached, and all he could do was meet her gaze. She held it unflinching, as though daring him to deny what had already been born between them. Behind her, the girls looked on, their faces bright with a hope as fragile as snowflakes. At last, Paul bowed his head, a gesture rough but full of weight. It was not yet a vow spoken aloud, but in that silence lay all the promise a man like him could give. The cabin door closed against the cold, firelight spilling across the rough-hewn floor. Outside, the snow covered the scars of battle, erasing footprints, muting blood. The mountain held its secrets, but within the cabin, warmth had kindled something new, fragile, fierce, and undeniable. And as night fell, a lone raven wheeled above the ridge, its cry carrying into the dark, a reminder that peace was never absolute. Somewhere beyond the valley, the world still hunted. But for this night, in this cabin, they belonged to one another, and that truth was enough to hold the storm at bay.